Clint Eastwood sits calmly under the bright studio lights, his weathered face unreadable as the TV host leans in with a smirk. The cameras are rolling, the audience is watching, and she sees an opportunity. Mocking his conservative beliefs right to his face, a chuckle ripples through the crowd, but Clint doesn't flinch. Instead, with the perfect blend of wisdom and wit, he delivers a response so sharp, so undeniable, it leaves the host stunned. The entire room shifts. Respect, silence, and then an unexpected reaction no one saw coming. What did he say that shut her down instantly? And how did the moment turn the tables in an unforgettable way? This is the Clint Eastwood you don't mess with. Stay tuned for the full story, because this is a comeback for the ages. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get started. The studio buzzed with anticipation. Bright stage lights beamed down, casting a sharp glow on the sleek, modern set. Rows of spectators filled the audience, their murmurs blending into a low hum of excitement. Cameras stood poised, their lenses fixed on the interview table where the night's guest, Clint Eastwood, sat with an air of quiet confidence. The host, a polished media personality in her late 40s, adjusted the papers in front of her, flashing a practiced smile. But behind her eyes, there was something else, a glint of amusement, maybe even condescension. She saw this as a game. The headlines had already written themselves in her mind. Hollywood icon faces tough questions. Clint Eastwood called out on live TV. She was ready for a moment that would trend, a soundbite that would explode across social media. Clint, however, wasn't playing. He leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting on the arms. The scent of freshly polished wood from the desk mixed with the faint aroma of coffee lingering from the production crew. His cowboy instincts, honed from a lifetime of reading people, sensed the subtle tension in the room. The host's tone, her body language. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was an ambush. Let him try, Clint thought, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He'd faced tougher critics before, and he never needed to raise his voice to make a statement. The host cleared her throat, ready to set the stage. The audience shifted, the lights intensified, and in that moment, Clint knew. This wasn't just another interview, it was a challenge. The host's smile widened as she leaned forward, her manicured fingers tapping lightly on the desk. The camera zoomed in, capturing every movement, every subtle shift in expression. Clint, you've been in Hollywood for decades, but let's talk about something more controversial, she said, her voice smooth but laced with challenge. Your political views have made headlines. Some say they're outdated. Some say they're outright problematic. Do you think you've lost touch with modern America? The air in the room tightened. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, while others sat up straighter, sensing the shift in energy. This wasn't just an interview, it was a moment designed to put him on the spot. Clint's fingers interlocked in front of him, his expression unreadable. But inside, a flicker of annoyance sparked. He had expected this. It was the same song and dance, a younger generation eager to discredit his perspective, as if time had made him irrelevant. I suppose that depends, he said, his voice slow and deliberate. On what you mean by modern America? The host seized the opening. Well, she continued, you've spoken about personal responsibility, traditional values. Some argue that these views no longer fit in today's progressive society. Do you ever wonder if maybe your time has passed? The question hung in the air. Some in the audience gasped softly. Others exchanged looks, eager to see how he would react. Clint exhaled through his nose, steady as ever, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of steel. He had spent his life standing up for what he believed in, refusing to be bullied into silence. And he certainly wasn't going to start now. "You know," he finally said, his voice as cool as ever, "I've seen a lot of things come and go in my lifetime. Trends, opinions, entire movements. Funny thing is, the truth never changes. It doesn't care whether it's fashionable or not." The host blinked, momentarily caught off guard. The audience murmured. Clint leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding. "You're asking if my time has passed? Let me ask you this. When did common sense expire?" The room fell silent. The host opened her mouth but hesitated. This wasn't the dismissive, fumbling response she had anticipated. Clint had just flipped the conversation on its head. The tension in the studio was thick now, charged with an electricity that couldn't be ignored. But Clint? He simply sat back, waiting. The studio lights cast a bright, almost clinical glow over the stage, illuminating every expression, every twitch of emotion on Clint Eastwood's face. The audience, a mix of Hollywood elites and eager viewers, sat in tense anticipation, eyes darting between the veteran actor and the host, who had clearly underestimated her opponent. The host recovered quickly, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's an interesting way to put it, Clint," she said, shifting in her chair. "But surely you can acknowledge that the world is evolving. Don't you think that holding on to, let's call them old-school values, might be, well, a little out of touch?" There it was again. The careful phrasing, the polished veneer of a question designed not for genuine discourse, but to corner him. Clint, however, had spent his entire career navigating a world that often sought to undermine him. He had been called many things: too rigid, too conservative, too unwilling to bow to the ever-changing tides of Hollywood. But he had also built a legacy on standing firm. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. "See, that's the funny thing," he said, his voice measured, as if weighing each word. "People keep acting like values have an expiration date, like respect, hard work, and integrity are just trends that come and go." The audience shifted, a ripple of murmurs passing through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged skeptical glances. The divide in the room was palpable, an invisible line drawn between those who respected his words and those who saw them as relics of another time. The host leaned in, sensing the growing friction. "But don't you think that society has a duty to evolve?" she pressed. "We can't just stay stuck in the past, can we?" Clint's jaw tightened. He had heard this argument before. This idea that change, no matter its form, was inherently good. That questioning the direction of that change made someone the enemy. "Evolving is one thing," he said, his voice firm. "Forgetting where you came from is another." The tension in the room thickened. The host's expression flickered with something unreadable. Was it frustration? Or perhaps just for a split second, doubt? But before she could respond, a voice from the audience broke the silence. "So what you're saying is, we should all just live like it's still the 1950s. The words were laced with sarcasm, and a few scattered laughs followed. Clint turned his head, scanning the crowd. A young man, maybe in his late 20s, sat with his arms crossed, eyebrows raised in challenge. Clint didn't flinch. Instead, he offered a small, knowing smile. "Let me ask you something, kid," he said. "Do you think courage, discipline, and standing up for what's right were only good ideas in the 1950s? The young man opened his mouth, then hesitated. Clint continued, his voice steady. "See, people love to package things up into neat little boxes, old versus new, past versus future. But the truth? It's not about decades, it's about principles, and principles don't have a shelf life." A hush settled over the studio. Even the host, who had been so confident in steering the conversation, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. But then, just as quickly, she pivoted. "Clint, no one is saying values aren't important, but surely you can see that progress means we have to adapt. We can't just hold on to everything from the past." Clint nodded slowly. "That's true, but progress without wisdom is just recklessness." The host blinked. "Look around," Clint continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "We live in a world where people are scared to speak their minds, where the moment you disagree, you're labeled, dismissed, cancelled." A murmur swept through the audience again. Some people shifted uncomfortably, while others sat up straighter, as if they had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. The host's polished exterior cracked just slightly, a flicker of defensiveness flashing across her face. "I don't think anyone here is suggesting that," she said, though the tightness in her tone betrayed her. Clint simply raised an eyebrow. "Aren't they?" For a moment, the studio felt like a battlefield. Two opposing forces standing their ground, each believing in their truth. The host had set out to corner him, to challenge him, in a way that would make for viral television. But Clint had turned the tables, making it clear that he wasn't afraid to push back. And just like that, the stakes were raised. The conflict was no longer just between a TV host and a Hollywood legend. It was between two ideologies, two perspectives, clashing under the bright lights of the studio, with millions of eyes watching. What would happen next? Would Clint back down, or would he deliver the one line that would change everything? The air in the studio was thick with tension. The host, who had started this exchange with confident smirks and well-rehearsed jabs, now seemed to be recalculating her approach. Clint Eastwood sat back, calm and unshaken, his eyes sharp, reading the room with the precision of a man who had been in 100 standoffs before. Only this time, the bullets were words, and the battlefield was public opinion. Then, the twist came. A producer, hidden just off camera, signaled to the host. A sudden shift in her demeanor, she was getting a note through her earpiece. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. Clint noticed. He leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped together. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen it all. The host forced a laugh. "Not at all," she said quickly. "I just think it's interesting that someone who's been in Hollywood for decades still holds on to these rigid views." And that's when Clint dropped the hammer. Rigid? He let the word hang in the air. "Let me tell you something about rigidity. You know what's really rigid? Fear." The host blinked. "Excuse me." Clint's voice remained steady, but now it carried a weight that silenced the room. People love to talk about progress, but half the time, they're not moving forward. They're just scared of standing still. They're scared that if they stop running long enough to think for themselves, they might not like what they see. The audience was no longer just watching. They were captivated. Some leaned forward, some exchanged glances. The host swallowed, shifting in her seat. Clint continued. You ever wonder why people get so angry when someone doesn't agree with them? Why they feel the need to silence, shame, and cancel instead of debate? He let the question linger. Because deep down, they're afraid. Afraid they might be wrong. And fear? Now that's rigid. The audience let out an audible gasp. The host opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then, as if on cue, Clint leaned back, allowing his words to settle. So you tell me, he said, eyes locked on hers. Who's really stuck in the past? Silence, thick, unbreakable. For the first time in the entire interview, the host had nothing to say. The silence in the studio stretched longer than anyone expected. The host, usually quick with a witty retort or a deflective joke, seemed frozen, eyes darting to the producers behind the cameras. Clint Eastwood, on the other hand, remained still, his presence commanding yet effortless. He had spoken his truth, and the weight of his words still hung in the air like a thick fog. Then, a nervous chuckle escaped the host's lips. Well, I guess that's one way to look at it, she said, but there was an undeniable shift in her tone, less condescension, more hesitation. Clint simply smiled. He wasn't here to win an argument. He never had been. That was the difference. He had nothing to prove. The audience, sensing the shift, began murmuring among themselves. Some nodded, others exchanged glances, and a few even clapped hesitantly. The energy in the room was no longer on the host's side. It had turned, not necessarily against her, but towards something deeper. The segment ended, and as the cameras powered down, the host exhaled, rubbing her temple as if trying to piece together what had just happened. Clint stood up, adjusting his jacket. He wasn't about to gloat or linger in the moment. He had made his point, and he was ready to walk away. But then, something unexpected happened. Wait. The host's voice stopped him. Clint turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated before speaking again, glancing around as if making sure no one else could hear. Do you really think people are afraid? Clint studied her for a moment before nodding. Most of them. Yeah. She crossed her arms, biting her lip. And what about you? You never feel afraid? Clint gave a small chuckle, the kind that carried the wisdom of decades. Of course I do. The trick is, I don't let it make decisions for me. The host blinked, as if that answer had been far too simple, yet painfully true. A long pause followed, and then, in a move that no one expected, she extended her hand. I appreciate you coming on, she said, this time with sincerity. Clint shook it, a firm grip, no hard feelings. As he walked off the stage, the cameras off, the audience still buzzing, the host sat there for a moment, longer than necessary, lost in thought. Maybe, just maybe, she had been the one who learned something today. The next time the host stepped onto that stage, something felt different. The bright studio lights were the same, the cameras rolled as usual, and the teleprompter scrolled with carefully crafted talking points. But inside her, something had shifted. She had spent the night replaying Clint Eastwood's words in her mind. The calm, unshakable confidence in his voice. The way he didn't need to shout, argue, or prove anything. He simply was. She had built her career on quick wit, sharp comebacks, and audience-pleasing jabs. But for the first time, she questioned whether she had ever really listened to someone she disagreed with. And it wasn't just about Clint. It was about fear. The kind of fear that dictates what people say, what they believe, what they allow themselves to consider. She had dismissed him at first, convinced she had the moral high ground. But now she wasn't so sure. That day, as the cameras went live, she caught herself before delivering a rehearsed line meant to mock a guest. Instead, she leaned in, truly listening. She didn't change overnight, but that small moment, her willingness to question, to reflect, was the beginning of something new. A shift, a lesson learned, and a door, perhaps, cracked open just enough to let a little more truth in. Clint Eastwood's response wasn't just a comeback. It was a lesson in confidence, conviction, and the power of standing firm in one's beliefs. In a world where debates often turn into shouting matches, his calm yet undeniable presence left a mark that couldn't be ignored. So what do you think? Have we lost the art of truly listening to opposing viewpoints? Do you believe confidence and wisdom can outshine mockery and ridicule? Let us know in the comments, whose side would you take in this debate? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more eye-opening moments that challenge perspectives and spark conversation.